In 1950, my great-aunt was accused of treason by the communist government of Czechoslovakia, and she was executed. Her name was Milada Horáková, and she was 48 years old at the time of her death. I'm told she led a remarkable life. She was a lawyer by profession. She served in the city council in Prague. She was a progressive politician. She fought for the rights of women and children. She fought in the resistance against the Nazis during World War II, was captured, sent to a concentration camp where she was sentenced to death, and her sentence was ultimately commuted to life, but she was finally freed by the Allies after the war. She returned to Czechoslovakia, where she became a member of parliament until 1948, when a communist coup took over the democratically elected government of Czechoslovakia. Her friends and her colleagues encouraged her to leave the country at that time for her own safety and the safety of her husband and her daughter, who is my aunt and godmother. But she refused, and sure enough, she was arrested and interrogated. She was later tortured, and she was put on trial. Among other things, she was accused, along with 12 others, of leading a terrorist cell whose aim was to subvert the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. The proceedings were completely scripted, though she managed to break away from the script often enough to declare her innocence and to stand up for what she believed in. And this story is actually very well known in the Czech Republic. There have been books written about her, an opera, which I haven't actually heard yet. And in my own family, we've talked a lot about her in my life as kids. My cousins and my siblings and I, we know her story. But it wasn't until recently that when I was reading about her, I saw she'd been labeled a terrorist. And this was very interesting to me because I, as a journalist, cover the war on terrorism. I have for the last decade or so. And I focus on how this war is unfolding here in the United States. And I've known for a long time, as I've reported on this, that there's no real single definition of the terrorist. There's no single legal definition, which is surprising, actually. If you look in the dictionary, you'll see that there's various formulations of the same definition, but basically they boil down to someone who threatens violence or commits violence with a political aim, politically motivated violence. But I think that this definition actually is pretty inadequate. And I don't think this just because of my great-aunt's story, but because of the many people who I've covered, the big terrorists who've been convicted here in the US over the last 10 years. In 2005, the defendant was a man named Hemant Lakhani. He was on trial for trying to purchase an illegal shoulder-fired missile, which he was intending to sell to a terrorist group in East Africa. It was a really big case at the time because it was sort of the first test case that was meant to deploy a new mandate after the 9/11 attacks that we should catch the terrorists before they next strike. This was an enormous transformation in our law enforcement system, which had focused before on gathering evidence of crimes past, and now law enforcement was supposed to gather intelligence on crimes that hadn't happened yet and to identify people who might commit those crimes. Mr. Lakhani became the first big experiment in this new mandate. He was actually not a great candidate if you looked at him. He had no history of violence, no real political leanings for most of his professional career. He traded in sugar, in textiles, he sold airplanes for a while. But he had the great misfortune of meeting up with an undercover FBI informant a couple months after the 9/11 attacks. This man was on the front lines of trying to catch these new terrorists. And he was a career informant who made his living as an informant, so he had a real incentive to find people like Mr. Lakhani. And Mr. Lakhani turned out to be a great subject because he was a very boastful man. And when they got to talking, he claimed that he could obtain all sorts of illegal things, missiles, nuclear material. At one point, he claimed he could obtain a submarine. He claimed he knew Muammar Gaddafi, Benazir Bhutto, the president of Uganda. He didn't know what night vision goggles were, but the case went forward anyway. And he did agree to this scheme of obtaining this missile. The only problem was that he really wasn't good at it. And if you've ever tried to obtain an illegal shoulder-fired missile, you know how hard that can be if you don't have the right contacts, which was the problem. He did not have the right contacts. And for a year he tried. He was actually so bad at this that when he went to the former Soviet republics, which is where everybody goes for illegal shoulder-fired missiles these days, he caught the attention of the Russian secret police almost instantly. And they now partnered with the Americans posing as the fictitious buyers of a missile, the Russians posing as the fictitious sellers of a missile, and Mr. Lakhani caught on tape holding a giant fake missile. He was arrested, needless to say, charged with crimes related to terrorism, offered a 5-year plea deal, which he rejected, foolishly, it turns out, though it does say something about how much of a national security threat the government thought of him. He went to trial, convicted, 40-plus years in prison was his sentence. It was a life sentence because he was in his 60s at the time of conviction. This case really blew my mind because I'd never seen anything like it. It was not just the drama, but it was such a big deal. The President of the United States at the time, George W. Bush, called it a great example, I quote, of how we are winning the war on terror. So I made this my beat, and I started to follow a lot of cases that were coming out of the US, and they all followed the same template. Fictitious plots, fake weapons, informants providing the incendiary rhetoric, which then elevates the crime to a level of terrorism. And at the center of it, people like Mr. Lakhani, who certainly were guilty of crimes, but certainly didn't sound like terrorists. They had no political motivations, were not even really adept at any kind of crime. Some of them were even mentally ill. At the same time as this was happening, there were other cases, like that of Joe Stack. You might have heard of him. A couple years ago, he flew a plane into an IRS building, leaving behind a manifesto and page after page of grievances against the government, and his case was not labeled an incident of terrorism. And so it became clear to me that the word terrorist is deployed very arbitrarily. My definition of the word terrorist is a little different. I say a terrorist is an enemy of the state as defined by the state. An enemy of the state as defined by the state. And I say this because we're now more than 10 years into the war on terror. And the war on terror has now slowly become institutionalized and permanent. And as it has done so, it has expanded to new categories. Anti-war protesters, people who attend Occupy movements all over the country. The surveillance tools and techniques that were approved after 9/11 are now being used for these types of new cases. It's noteworthy, too, that these kinds of techniques which were brought in after 9/11 were rejected in the past because they infringed on civil liberties and due process. But now, under the guise of national security, under the blanket of national security, they've been reintroduced. My great-aunt's case at the time of her trial got a lot of attention. People like Winston Churchill and Eleanor Roosevelt and Albert Einstein wrote letters pleading for clemency in her case. Outside of Czechoslovakia, the perpetrators of the terror were not the defendants in the case, but the state itself. And this actually kind of makes sense because the root of the word terrorist goes back to the French Revolution, when the Jacobin government unleashed a reign of terror against the people of France, and they called themselves terrorists. The word today is completely opposite. We've gone from the state, synonymous with terror, to the terrorist as the enemy of the state, but as defined by the state. So my message today at this conference is that words matter. Definitions matter, especially powerful words like this that have powerful consequences for those against whom they're deployed. And we should question those definitions, and we should question the narratives of where those words have come from. And the secondary message, of course, is if you're ever asked to obtain a shoulder-fired missile, your answer should be no. Thank you.